Why did the ancients go to the trouble to build ancient monuments? I think it comes out of a tradition of just getting together for seasonal meetings. This goes back, I'm thinking, to the Mesolithic sort of period. You're basically hunter-gathering tribes. You've got to disperse out and about to survive. Otherwise there wouldn't be enough animals and stuff to survive. Yet every now and again, presumably once a year, perhaps twice a year, you need to get together and meet your relatives. As we might politely say, expand the gene pool and all these sort of things. So when I look at Avery, I think in sort of chronological terms, I think initially Windmill Hill, the earliest of the Neolithic causeway camps, and the south slopes from there, which face towards the later Henge. I've got plenty of settlement evidence. The Mesolithic people were definitely coming up there and gathering. And I think for some reason, you then decide to do something very radical that really had not been done before, and that's actually modify the landscape, modify what presumably was thought of as the sacred earth in some way. I think probably quite a sophisticated way, not a simplistic way. So at that point you start digging the ditches, presumably as a communal effort. You can see from the ditches the straight section, straight section, straight section. It did about 10 metres, 20 metres each little group, and it eventually all joined up. Or one summer, series of summers, series of meetings, who knows, and that's not clear. But why do ancient sites have such an effect on people? I suppose the long-winded answer to your question is really, I wrote a whole book called Sacred Places and the invention of the idea of prehistoric sacred places 7 or 8 years ago now. I think part of it is just from the modern mindset is that they are so different to anything that we're really used to. You know, they're not like a football stadium, they're not like a big theatre or a concert hall and so forth. And yet they're monumental, and yet they're architectural. And even relatively small stone circles, you know, ones much, much smaller than Avery and so forth, we can still relate to as architecture and as monuments. And there is that whole sense of what monuments do best. They endure. They've been there for whatever, 5,000 years, whatever age we're putting on a particular monument, and people in some way relate to that and say, wow, you know, and start to want to ask at least some sort of questions about that past. And sure, the more you ask those questions, the more you look at that past, and the more interesting it gets, I think, and people just get hooked on it, and they want to do a Julian Cope and visit everyone there ever is, and all the rest of it, and away it goes. You've got obsessives like me, you know. What sort of message were they giving to future generations? If you change from, say, the causeway camps to thinking about the chamber tombs, West Kennet Longbarrow and those sort of monuments, of which there are a great many, clearly I think there is a very intentional statement to future generations. You know, we are buried here, it's our lineage that belongs on this land. It is, you know, the origin of expressions like motherland or even fatherland and so forth. I think it's from the genetic stuff that's been done, it is more of a fatherland to which the women married into those tribes. So yeah, I think there is quite a sophisticated message going on, but we can only see a certain amount of evidence and come up with a fairly simplistic argument. My feeling is that for the people at the time, it would have been a much more developed and nuanced way of thinking about it. Whether they were looking beyond a few lifetimes and a few generations in the future, well, I'm not so sure. I can't see the evidence for that. I'm not quite sure how far in the future they were expecting these monuments to last. But yeah, I mean, the magnitude and the technology is mind-boggling for us. I mean, even just to re-erect some of the bigger standing stones is a challenge. Yes, I mean, it had to be a society where a significant number of people could get together and stay together for at least a week, 2 weeks or whatever. They couldn't be hunter-gathering anymore because you couldn't hunt and gather for that many people in a small area. You just run out of resources within a few days. You had to have invented farming. You've got to bring the food with you on the hoof in terms of cattle or sheep and goats and or pigs even, or you've got to bring it as corn and possibly bake it into bread. But there's a much easier way of getting the nutrition out of corn, of course, and that's to steep it in some warm water for about a week, and you get just the same nutrient and a lot more fun. And when you're thinking about these huge stones, and even the smaller stones, but a larger number of them, and moving them around, Yes, it is difficult for us to conceive. We think in terms of big bits of earth-moving equipment and so forth, but we've only had those for 100 years, 250 years with steam stuff. Before that, we were digging thundering great canals just with shovels and wheelbarrows and so forth. So it's amazing what can be done by enough people. I'm sure the people at the time would love the stones to be moved around by magic, but I think in practice it was just teamwork and experience. And you would have had a sense of just moving a stone over a landscape that wasn't already cleared. So if you wanted one particular bit of sarsen from the Avery area, you've probably got to move quite a lot of other sarsens out the way to clear the path to move that particular stone. And of course, now that all the other sarsens are mostly gone and we're only left with the megaliths of the Henge and so forth, we forget that. But there was actually a process of clearing a path would have been as much effort and as monumental as moving particular stones, but we don't see that anymore. Once you live in a more rural environment, and it doesn't have to be Avery. I mean, I lived in a Leicestershire village for 25 years. And once you get away from street lighting, you're very much aware of whether it's a new moon or not. I mean, if I want to get 200 yards up the road in Avery to get to the Red Lion, and when it's a new moon, I've got to remember to take a torch with me. When it's a full moon, why bother? I could, make my way around quite comfortably. So you're very much aware of what the moon and the sun are doing. When I left home this morning quite early to drive over from Avery to get to Glastonbury to set up, the rising sun was just right behind me as I was heading in towards Devizes and then on to Frome and so forth. Very much prominent, okay, in my rear view mirror, but the shadow of the vehicle in the road in front of me and so forth. It is part of the experience of life. And in a society which perhaps hasn't got pubs and televisions in the evening and this sort of thing, you're going to be very much aware of the stars. And whilst I didn't include it in the talk, quite clearly, if you are making your way around by water or by land or whatever else, and you want to do it after dark, and the only way of keeping your sense of where you are and where you're going is to know how the stars move and so forth. And they are bright and they are distinctive, and it's very easy to sort of come up with stories that remind you in what order the constellations appear every night and so forth, and at what point they rise up. And that, I think, is the origin of a lot of myths and a lot of legends and so forth. But we forget the overall story and just remember the interesting story rather than the why.